The dust kicked up around her boots as Beatrice Ramsey stepped off the afternoon stage into McGill, Nevada. And within seconds, she knew this town would be no different than all the others. The year was 1882, and the silver mining boom had brought all kinds of people to this stretch of desert, but none of them seemed prepared for a woman who walked with a pronounced limp, dragging her left leg slightly with each determined step she took across the rutted Main Street. She had barely made it halfway to the boarding house when the whispers started. Two women in faded calico dresses stood outside the general store, their hands rising to cover their mouths as they leaned together. But Beatrice could still hear their words carried on the hot September wind. A group of miners lounging against the saloon wall nudged each other, their laughter rough and cruel. One of them called out something she pretended not to hear, though the heat rising in her cheeks had nothing to do with the Nevada sun beating down on her dark brown hair. Beatrice had been born with her leg twisted. The doctors had told her mother. 22 years of living with it had given her strength in other ways, though people rarely looked past the physical imperfection to see the resilience underneath. She had come to McGill with nothing but a worn carpetbag, a letter of introduction to the schoolhouse, and the fierce hope that maybe this time would be different. The town needed a teacher, and she had graduated top of her class from the normal school in Sacramento. Her credentials were impeccable. Her references glowed, but all anyone ever saw was the way she walked. The boarding house was run by a severe-looking woman named Mrs. Patterson, who took Beatrice's money readily enough, but made sure to mention that the room was on the second floor. The implication hung in the air between them. Beatrice simply nodded, gripped the railing, and made her way up the stairs with the same deliberate grace she had perfected over 2 decades. It took longer than it would have taken someone else. It always did. But she made it, and that was what mattered. That evening, she ventured out to see the town properly. McGill was rough around the edges, built hastily to house the workers who labored in the silver mines that honeycombed the hills. The Main Street boasted a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and the one-room schoolhouse where she would begin teaching on Monday. False-fronted buildings lined the dusty thoroughfare, and the constant sound of hammering suggested the town was still growing. Beatrice tried to imagine the children who would sit in those schoolhouse desks, wondering if they would be cruel like their parents, or if youth might still contain some kindness. She was standing outside the schoolhouse, peering through the window at the neat rows of desks, when she heard the boots approaching behind her. Heavy footsteps, but measured, not rushing. She turned to find a man watching her from a respectful distance, his hat in his hands. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of river stones. His dark hair was a bit too long, curling slightly at his collar, and there was something gentle in the way he held himself, despite the gun belt at his hips and the dust that covered his clothes from a day's work. "Evening, madam," he said, his voice a low drawl that carried the hint of Texas in its vowels. "I am Samuel Thornton. I work at the mine, but I also serve on the school board. Thought I should introduce myself before Monday comes around." Beatrice straightened her shoulders, ready for the usual dance of polite words that masked disappointment. "Beatrice Ramsey. I am pleased to meet you, Mr. Thornton." He stepped closer, and she noticed he did not let his gaze drop to her leg. His eyes stayed on her face, direct and honest. "I read your letters of recommendation. The board was impressed. We have been without a proper teacher for near about 6 months now. The children have been running wild, and their parents are eager to see them getting proper schooling again." "I hope to meet their expectations," Beatrice said carefully. Samuel nodded, a slight smile crossing his face. "I reckon you will." The previous teacher was a man of about 60 who spent most of his time asleep at his desk. "From what I read about you, I expect you will be a considerable improvement." It was such a straightforward compliment, so free of the pity or condescension she usually encountered, that Beatrice found herself smiling back. "I certainly do not plan to sleep through my lessons." "That is a fine start," Samuel said. He settled his hat back on his head, tipping it slightly. "If you need anything, Miss Ramsey, anything at all to help you settle in or prepare the schoolhouse, you just let me know. Welcome to McGill." He walked away before she could respond, his long strides carrying him back toward the center of town. Beatrice watched him go, something warm and unexpected blooming in her chest. It was too early to call it hope, but it was something close. Sunday morning brought the obligation of church, and Beatrice dressed in her best dress, a deep blue cotton with black trim that she had sewn herself. The church was small, the pews hard, and the congregation curious. She felt their eyes on her as she made her way down the aisle, heard the whispers that followed her halting gait. The minister, Reverend Clark, was a portly man with kind eyes who welcomed her warmly enough, but the women of the congregation kept their distance after the service, forming tight clusters that did not include her. Beatrice stood alone on the church steps, watching families disperse to their Sunday dinners when she heard a voice beside her. "They will come around." She turned to find Samuel Thornton, clean-shaven and wearing what was clearly his best shirt. "Will they?" she asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. "Some will. Some would not come around if an angel descended from heaven and told them to." He offered his arm. "May I walk you back to the boarding house? It is on my way." Beatrice hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. She was not sure what surprised her more, that he had offered or that she had accepted. They walked slowly, and she realized with a start that he was matching his pace to hers without making a show of it. Most people either rushed ahead, impatient, or walked painfully slowly, making her feel like a burden. "How long have you been in McGill?" she asked. 3 years this October. Came out from Texas after my father passed. He had been a rancher, but the ranch went to my older brother, as was right. I needed to make my own way." He paused, then added, "I started in the mines, but I have been saving my wages. I aim to buy some land east of here, start raising cattle. The mining will not last forever, but cattle always will." "That sounds like a solid plan," Beatrice said. "Do you have enough saved?" "Almost. Another year, maybe 2, and I will have what I need." There was determination in his voice, the kind that came from years of patient work toward a distant goal. They reached the boarding house too quickly. Samuel tipped his hat to her again, and Beatrice climbed the stairs to her room feeling lighter than she had in months. That night, she prepared her lessons for the week, arranging the primers and slates she had brought with her, planning activities that would assess what the children already knew and what they needed to learn. Monday morning arrived with cloudless skies and temperatures that would climb into the 90s by afternoon. Beatrice arrived at the schoolhouse an hour early, sweeping the floors and opening the windows to catch whatever breeze might develop. She wrote the day's lessons on the blackboard in her neat script and stood at the door to greet each student as they arrived. They came in groups and pairs, 15 children ranging from 6 to 14 years old. The older boys looked skeptical, sizing her up with the calculation of young men who had probably driven off the last teacher with their mischief. The younger children stared openly at the way she moved. But Beatrice had been teaching in various schools for 3 years now, and she knew how to command a classroom. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I am Miss Ramsey, your new teacher. We are going to learn a great many things together this year, and I expect each of you to work hard and treat each other with respect." In return, I promise to be fair, patient, and to answer any honest question you bring to me. Now, please take your seats and we will begin with introductions." The morning went smoothly enough. The children were behind where they should have been, but they were not unteachable. The older boys tested her once, whispering and laughing during the reading lesson, but Beatrice simply stopped speaking and waited, her gaze steady, until the room fell silent. Then she continued as if nothing had happened. By noon, when she dismissed them for lunch, she felt cautiously optimistic. The afternoon brought arithmetic and geography, and by the time 3 o'clock arrived, Beatrice was exhausted but satisfied. She stood at the door, wishing each child a good afternoon, reminding them to complete the reading she had assigned. When the last student had gone, she returned to her desk and sank into the chair, allowing herself a moment to rest her aching leg. That was when she heard the voices outside. Adult voices, raised in conversation. Beatrice rose and went to the window. A group of 5 townspeople stood in the street, 3 women and 2 men, and they were talking to Samuel Thornton. She could not hear everything, but she caught enough words to understand. They were complaining about her. About having a cripple teaching their children. About what kind of example that set. About how she would never be able to keep up with the demands of the job. Beatrice felt her stomach drop. She had known this was coming. It always came. She began gathering her things, preparing for the inevitable moment when the school board would tell her they had made a mistake, that her services were no longer needed. But Samuel's voice cut through the complaints, sharp and clear. "I have heard enough. Miss Ramsey is the most qualified teacher we have had in 5 years. She has a degree, excellent references, and from what I saw when I looked in on the class this afternoon, she has those children actually paying attention for once. But Samuel, you cannot deny that she is," one of the women began, "crippled. Is that the word you are dancing around, Mrs. Henderson?" Samuel's voice was hard now. "Because if we are going to reject people based on their bodies not being perfect, we might as well dismiss half the men working in the mines. Should we send Tom Morrison home because he is missing 2 fingers? Tell old Mr. Chen to leave town because he has a bad back." Miss Ramsey walked all the way from California with a heavy bag and climbed 2 flights of stairs to her room without asking for help. She stood in front of 15 restless children all day and taught them reading and mathematics and geography. What more do you want from a teacher? "It is not seemly," Mr. Henderson said. "The children mock her. We heard them talking about it at supper." "Then their parents should teach them better manners," Samuel shot back. "A person's worth is not measured by how straight they walk. It is measured by their character, their knowledge, their compassion. Miss Ramsey has all of those in abundance. If you cannot see that, the failing is yours, not hers." There was a long silence. Then Samuel added quietly but with steel underneath, "She walks taller than any of you." Beatrice pressed her hand to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. No one had ever defended her like that. No one had ever seen past the limp to the person she was underneath. She watched as the group dispersed, muttering among themselves, and Samuel stood alone in the street, staring after them with his hands on his hips. She should have stayed inside, should have pretended she had not heard. But instead, she found herself opening the schoolhouse door and stepping out into the afternoon heat. Samuel turned at the sound, and his expression softened when he saw her. "Miss Ramsey, I apologize if I was too forward, but I meant every word." "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did." He walked toward her, stopping at the base of the schoolhouse steps. "This town has good people in it, but it has small-minded ones too. The good ones need to speak up more often. I should have spoken up the first time I heard someone say something unkind. You heard them before today, in the saloon, at the mine, outside the church. Small towns talk. He looked away, jaw tight. I am ashamed to say I let it pass the first few times. I will not make that mistake again. Beatrice descended the steps carefully until she stood on the same level as him. Up close, she could see the sincerity in his face, the anger still simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Walk with me," she asked impulsively. They walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrub brush and the hills rose in the distance, studded with the dark mouths of mine shafts. The air was cooler here, the breeze stronger. Beatrice found a flat rock and sat, grateful to rest her leg. Samuel remained standing, looking out at the landscape. "I was born this way," Beatrice said. The words came out before she could stop them. "The doctors told my mother it was just bad luck the way I formed before I was born. She loved me anyway. Raised me to believe I could do anything I set my mind to. But the world has spent 22 years trying to convince me otherwise." "The world is often wrong," Samuel said. "Is it?" Beatrice looked down at her hands. "There are days I wonder if everyone else is right and I am the fool for trying." Samuel turned to face her fully. "You are not a fool, you are brave, braver than most people I have known, and I have known some courageous souls." He paused, then continued, "My younger sister had a weak heart. The doctors said she would not live past 10. She made it to 15, and every single day of those 15 years, she lived with more joy and determination than anyone I have ever met. She taught me that strength comes in many forms, that walking tall has nothing to do with your legs and everything to do with your spirit." "What was her name?" Beatrice asked softly. "Margaret. Maggie, we called her." Samuel's voice was rough with old grief. "She has been gone 7 years now, but I still think about her every day. She would have liked you." They sat together in companionable silence as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Beatrice felt something shifting inside her, the walls she had built around her heart developing cracks. She barely knew this man, but already he had shown her more kindness than most people managed in a lifetime. "I should get back," she said finally. "Mrs. Patterson serves supper at 6, and she does not hold plates for latecomers." Samuel walked her back to the boarding house, and this time when they parted, he held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "I mean, if you do not mind the company after school." "I do not mind," Beatrice said, and she was smiling as she climbed the stairs. The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm. Beatrice taught her students, who slowly warmed to her as they realized she was patient but firm, creative with her lessons, and genuinely interested in helping them learn. Samuel appeared at the schoolhouse each afternoon, and they would walk or sit together, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about Texas, about growing up on a ranch with 4 siblings, about the hard work of mining and his dreams for the future. She told him about her childhood in Sacramento, her mother who had passed 2 years ago, her determination to prove that her disability did not define her capabilities. They were careful, maintaining propriety. He never touched her except to offer his arm. They always stayed in sight of the town. But something was growing between them, delicate and precious as a desert flower after rain. Then came the day that changed everything. It was late October, and the heat had finally broken, replaced by cooler temperatures that made walking more pleasant. Beatrice dismissed her students and was tidying the classroom when she heard shouting in the street. She hurried to the door to find a crowd gathering near the saloon. "Cave in at the mine," someone shouted. "The eastern shaft, at least a dozen men trapped." Beatrice's blood ran cold. Samuel worked the eastern shaft. She knew because he had mentioned it just yesterday, talking about a new vein of silver they had found. Women were crying. Men were running toward the mine with shovels and ropes. The whole town mobilized in minutes. Beatrice stood frozen, her mind racing. Then she forced herself to move. She could not dig, could not help with the physical rescue, but she could do other things. She ran to the church, found Reverend Clark, and together they organized the women to bring water, food, and medical supplies to the mine. She helped tear sheets into bandages, coordinated the cooking of vast pots of stew to feed the rescuers, made herself useful in every way she could. The rescue took 14 hours. Beatrice stayed at the mine through the night, her legs screaming in protest but her will refusing to give in. She handed out water, wrapped blankets around exhausted men who emerged from the depths covered in rock dust, and prayed harder than she had prayed in years. Dawn was breaking when they finally brought Samuel out. He was alive, conscious, but his left arm was badly injured, crushed under a fallen beam. The doctor, an older man named Pike, examined him right there in the open air, and Beatrice pushed through the crowd to see. "Miss Ramsey," Samuel said when he spotted her, managing a weak smile. "You should not be here, you should be resting." "Do not tell me what I should be doing," she said, her voice shaking. She looked at Dr. Pike. "How bad is it?" "Bad," the doctor said bluntly. "The arm is broken in 3 places and there is significant tissue damage. He will heal, but it will take time and the arm may never regain full strength or mobility." Beatrice watched Samuel absorb this information, watched him understand what it meant. A miner needed 2 strong arms. His dream of saving enough money for land for cattle had just become infinitely more difficult. "Can I take him somewhere?" Beatrice asked. "Somewhere quiet where he can rest properly." Mrs. Patterson, who had been helping with the rescue efforts, stepped forward. "He can have the room next to yours, Miss Ramsey. No charge until he is back on his feet." It was unprecedented kindness from the stern boarding house keeper, and Beatrice nearly wept with gratitude. Between her, Dr. Pike, and another miner, they got Samuel to the boarding house and into bed. The doctor splinted the arm, left laudanum for the pain, and promised to check back in the evening. Beatrice sat in the chair beside Samuel's bed, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Her leg throbbed, her back ached, and she had not slept in over 30 hours. But she could not seem to make herself leave. "You stayed all night," Samuel said softly. "At the mine." "Of course I did. Your leg must be hurting something fierce." "My leg is always hurting," Beatrice said. "I am used to it, but your arm is a new injury and a serious one. Let me worry about you for once." Samuel looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Beatrice, that is the first time you have used my given name." She had not even realized. "Samuel," she said again, testing how it felt. "Right, it felt right. Rest now. I will be next door if you need anything." She forced herself to stand to walk to the door, but his voice stopped her. "I am scared," he admitted. "If I cannot work the mines, I cannot save money. If I cannot save money, I cannot buy land. And if I cannot do that, what kind of future do I have?" Beatrice returned to his bedside. She took his good hand in both of hers, the first time she had initiated such contact. "You will heal, you will find a way, and you will not do it alone. I promise you that." She did not know where the words came from, what made her so bold. But Samuel's fingers tightened around hers, and she knew he understood what she was really saying. Over the next weeks, Beatrice divided her time between teaching and helping Samuel recover. She brought him meals, read to him in the evenings, changed his bandages when Dr. Pike showed her how. The town, which had watched their growing friendship with suspicious interest, now seemed to accept them as a pair. The same women who had complained about Beatrice teaching their children now nodded approvingly when they saw her climbing the stairs with a dinner tray. Samuel was not an easy patient. He chafed at the inactivity, frustrated by his helplessness. The mine company had given him a small sum to tide him over, but it was a fraction of his usual wages, and his savings were dwindling. "I feel useless," he said one evening in late November. They were in his room, Beatrice sitting in her usual chair while Samuel sat propped up in bed. His arm was healing, but slowly. "I am 26 years old, and I am being cared for like an invalid. You were trapped in a collapsed mine," Beatrice said. "You are recovering from serious injuries." "There is no shame in needing help," says the woman who never asks for any. "That is different." "How?" Samuel challenged. "How is it different? You push yourself until you are exhausted every single day. You climb those stairs when I know your leg is hurting. You teach all day and then come here to care for me at night. When do you rest, Beatrice? When do you let yourself be human?" His words struck deeper than he probably knew. Beatrice set down the book she had been reading from. "I learned a long time ago that the moment I show weakness, people use it as an excuse to dismiss me. If I am to be taken seriously, I must be twice as strong, twice as capable, twice as determined as anyone else. That is a lonely way to live." "Yes," she admitted, "it is." Samuel shifted, wincing as he moved his injured arm. "What if you did not have to be strong all the time? What if there was someone you could lean on when you needed to?" Her heart was pounding. "Is that what you are offering?" "I am offering whatever you want," Samuel said. His river stone eyes were steady on hers. "Friendship, partnership, companionship. More than that if you would have me. I know I am not much of a prospect right now. I am injured, my savings are nearly gone, and my future is uncertain. But I am falling in love with you, Beatrice Ramsey, and I needed you to know." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Beatrice felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but for once they were not tears of frustration or pain. They were tears of overwhelming relief. "I have been half in love with you since the day you defended me in the street," she whispered. "Since you said I walked taller than everyone else. No one has ever seen me the way you do." "Then let me keep seeing you," Samuel said. "Let me court you properly once I am back on my feet. Let me prove that I mean every word." Beatrice stood, crossed to the bed, and leaned down to kiss him gently. It was chaste, just a press of lips, but it sealed a promise between them. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it." By Christmas, Samuel was up and moving, his arm still weak but functional. He could not return to the mines, not to the hard physical labor he had been doing. But the mine foreman, a gruff man named Carson who had always respected Samuel's work ethic, offered him a position as a logistics coordinator, managing supplies and schedules. The pay was not as good as mining wages, but it was steady, and it did not require the same physical strength. Beatrice hosted a small Christmas celebration in the schoolhouse for her students, and Samuel helped her decorate, stringing popcorn garlands and paper chains. The children were excited, reciting the poems they had learned and singing carols with more enthusiasm than skill. Several parents attended, and Beatrice saw approval in their faces now, acceptance that had been hard-won but was finally genuine. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Samuel and Beatrice walked through the quiet town. There was a chill in the air, unusual for Nevada but not unheard of in the winter. Samuel had given her a woolen shawl as a Christmas gift, and she wore it wrapped around her shoulders. "I have been thinking," Samuel said, "about the future, about what I want." "What do you want?" Beatrice asked. "I want that land I have been dreaming of. I want to raise cattle and horses. I want to build a house with my own hands." He stopped walking, turned to face her. "And I want you in that house with me, as my wife if you will have me." Beatrice's breath caught. "Samuel, are you proposing?" "Not formally." "Not yet." He touched her face gently with his good hand. "I want to do it properly with a ring and everything." But I needed you to know where my thoughts are tending. I needed to know if you could see that kind of future with me. Could she? Beatrice looked at this man who had seen past her limitations to the strength beneath, who had defended her when she could not defend herself, who had shown her that love did not mean giving up independence, but rather finding someone to share the burden with. Yes, she said. I can see that future very clearly. They were married in April, in the small church with half the town in attendance. Beatrice wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar that Samuel's mother had sent all the way from Texas. Samuel wore a new suit, and when he promised to love and cherish her in sickness and in health, his voice was strong and sure. The mine company gave them a wedding gift of sorts, a lease on a parcel of land about 10 miles east of McGill, at rates so favorable it was essentially charity. Carson, the foreman, admitted that several of the miners had pooled money for it, wanting to help the man who had always been fair and the teacher who had earned their children's devotion. Beatrice continued teaching through the end of the school year, and Samuel worked his logistics job while spending every spare moment on their new land. By summer, he had built a small cabin, just 2 rooms but sturdy and well made. They moved in on a blazing July day, and that night they sat on their front porch, looking out at the scrub brush and distant hills that were now theirs. "Are you happy?" Samuel asked. Beatrice leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be." The first year was hard work. Samuel began building his herd, starting with just 6 cattle purchased from a rancher in the next county. Beatrice took a job teaching from home, tutoring children from several families in the area who could not make it to the McGill school regularly. She discovered she preferred this arrangement, the flexibility it offered, the way she could rest when her leg needed it without worrying about what people would think. They learned to work together, each compensating for the other's limitations. Samuel's arm never regained full strength, but Beatrice helped with tasks that required 2 strong hands. Her leg made some work impossible, but Samuel never complained about the extra burden. They were partners in the truest sense, building a life from nothing but determination and love. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Beatrice realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had always wanted children, but had wondered if her condition would make pregnancy and childbirth more dangerous. Dr. Pike, who made the journey from McGill to check on her, was cautiously optimistic. "Your leg will not affect the pregnancy itself," he said. "But carrying extra weight will make walking more difficult. You will need to rest more. Let Samuel take on the household tasks." It was good advice, though hard to follow. Beatrice was used to pushing through pain, to never admitting weakness. But Samuel was gentle and insistent, taking over the cooking and cleaning, helping her with everything from bathing to getting dressed as her pregnancy progressed. Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1885, after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours. It was difficult and exhausting, and there was a moment when Dr. Pike's face grew grim and Beatrice thought she might not survive. But Samuel held her hand through every contraction, wiped her face with cool cloths, murmured encouragement and love, and somehow she found the strength to bring their child into the world. They named him Matthew, after Samuel's father. He was healthy and loud, with his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn determination. When Samuel placed the baby in Beatrice's arms for the first time, she wept with relief and overwhelming love. "We made a person," she said, marveling at the tiny fingers wrapped around hers. "We did," Samuel agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "And he is perfect." Being parents transformed them in ways they had not anticipated. Samuel became even gentler, endlessly patient with Matthew's crying and needs. Beatrice discovered depths of strength she had not known she possessed, managing to care for an infant while dealing with her own physical challenges. There were days when everything felt impossible, when she was exhausted beyond measure and her leg hurt so badly she could barely stand. But Samuel was always there, taking Matthew when she needed to rest, rubbing her sore muscles, reminding her that she did not have to be strong every moment. As Matthew grew into a toddler, the ranch grew with him. Samuel's herd increased to 30 cattle. He bought 2 horses, beautiful animals that Beatrice loved to watch galloping across their land, even though she could never ride them. They added 2 more rooms to the cabin, making space for their growing family and the future they continued to build. The town of McGill remained part of their lives. They traveled there every few weeks for supplies and church, and Beatrice still taught the occasional student who needed extra help. The people who had once mocked her now greeted her with respect. She was Mrs. Thornton, the rancher's wife, the woman who had proven herself over and over again. But the real validation came from within, from knowing she had built a life on her own terms, with a man who loved her not despite her differences, but including all of them. Samuel never saw her limp as something to overcome or hide. It was simply part of who she was, like his weakened arm was part of who he had become. They were both imperfect, both scarred by life, and they loved each other all the more for it. When Matthew was 3 years old, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because her body had learned what to do. Their daughter was born on a warm September day, arriving so quickly that Dr. Pike barely made it in time. They named her Margaret after Samuel's sister, and she was tiny and fierce from her first breath. Where Matthew was patient and thoughtful, Maggie was bold and adventurous, crawling at 6 months and walking at 9. She kept them both busy, and Beatrice often laughed at how this child who had no physical limitations still managed to be more challenging than her older brother. The years passed in a blur of growth and change. Matthew started school in McGill, riding there each day on the gentle mare Samuel had bought specifically for that purpose. Maggie followed a few years later, and the cabin that had once seemed spacious now felt cramped with 2 energetic children. So Samuel built again, adding a second story and expanding the kitchen. He did most of the work himself, his arm having strengthened over the years even if it would never be what it once was. By 1892, 10 years after Beatrice had stepped off the stage in McGill, the Thornton Ranch was one of the most prosperous in the area. Samuel's herd had grown to over 100 head of cattle, and he had started breeding horses as well. Beatrice had published several articles about teaching methods in education journals, earning a small income and a reputation that extended far beyond Nevada. Their children were healthy and happy, thriving in the life their parents had built for them. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel took Beatrice back to the spot outside McGill where they had sat on that first walk together, where she had told him about being born with her twisted leg, and he had told her about his sister Margaret. The landscape had not changed much, still scrub brush and distant hills, but everything else was different. "You remember what I said to you that day?" Samuel asked. "About you being brave." "I remember," Beatrice said. "I want you to know that watching you these past 10 years has only confirmed it. Watching you become a mother, build our home, face down every challenge that came our way. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Beatrice. And I am honored every single day that you chose to walk through life beside me." Beatrice took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "You gave me something I never thought I would have, not just love, though that would have been enough. You gave me the freedom to be myself, completely and without apology. You taught me that I did not have to prove my worth to anyone, that I was enough exactly as I was. That is a gift beyond measure." They sat together in the fading light, comfortable in the silence of two people who knew each other completely. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, the endless Nevada landscape stretching out before them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice lonely and wild. "What do you think the future holds?" Beatrice asked. Samuel considered the question. "More of this, I hope, watching our children grow, building the ranch, growing old together. Maybe grandchildren someday, though I am in no rush for that." Beatrice laughed. "Matthew is only 10. I think we have time before we need to worry about grandchildren." "Good, because I am not ready to be a grandfather. I am barely used to being a father." He paused, then added, "I love you, Beatrice. I have loved you from the moment I saw you standing outside that schoolhouse, determined and brave and refusing to apologize for existing. I will love you until my last breath." "I love you too," Beatrice said. "So much it still surprises me sometimes." I had resigned myself to a life alone, convinced that no one would ever see past my leg to the person underneath. And then you walked into my life and changed everything. They stayed until the stars came out, brilliant pinpoints in the vast Nevada sky. Then they rode home together, back to their ranch, their children, their life. It was not a perfect life. There were still hard days when Beatrice's leg hurt so badly she could barely move, when Samuel's arm ached with old pain, when money was tight or the cattle got sick or the children fought. But it was their life, built on honesty and mutual respect, and a love that had only deepened with time. As the years continued to unfold, the Thornton family became a fixture in the McGill community. Matthew grew into a serious young man who loved books as much as ranching, eventually going to university in Carson City to study agriculture. Maggie became a skilled horsewoman, fearless in a way that both terrified and delighted her parents. She had inherited her mother's determination and her father's gentle heart, and everyone predicted she would do something remarkable with her life. Samuel expanded the ranch gradually, adding more land when opportunities arose, diversifying into sheep as well as cattle. His reputation as a fair dealer and honest businessman spread throughout the region. People came from other towns to buy his horses, which were known for their quality and temperament. He never forgot where he had started, though, and he made a point of hiring men who had been injured in the mines, men who needed second chances like he once had. Beatrice never returned to formal teaching, but she continued to tutor children who struggled in school, often for free. She developed a specialty in working with children who had their own physical challenges, understanding in ways other teachers could not what it meant to navigate a world that was not built for you. Parents traveled from across the state to bring their children to her, and more than one family moved to McGill specifically so their child could work with Mrs. Thornton. In 1898, when Beatrice was 38 years old, she received a letter from the Nevada Department of Education. They were compiling a book of successful teaching methods and wanted to include a chapter written by her, focusing on how to educate children with physical disabilities. It was an honor she had never expected, validation from the educational establishment that her work mattered, that her methods had value. She spent months writing and revising the chapter, wanting every word to be perfect. Samuel read each draft, offering suggestions and encouragement. When the book was finally published the following year, Beatrice held the leather-bound volume in her hands and cried. Her name was there, in print, alongside respected educators from across the state. It was proof that she had made a difference, that her life had mattered for more than just surviving. The turn of the century brought changes to McGill and to the West in general. The mines were beginning to play out, and families were leaving for new opportunities elsewhere. The Thorntons stayed, their ranch now well established and profitable. They watched the town shrink somewhat, saw buildings close and families disappear, but McGill remained their home. Matthew graduated from university in 1902 and returned to the ranch, bringing with him new ideas about cattle breeding and land management. He had met a young woman named Catherine at school, a doctor's daughter from Virginia City, and he brought her home to meet his parents. Beatrice liked Catherine immediately, recognizing in her the same quiet strength and intelligence that had served Beatrice well in her own life. They were married that fall, and Catherine moved into the ranch house, which Samuel had expanded once again to accommodate the next generation. She was fascinated by Beatrice's work with disabled children and began assisting with the tutoring, her medical knowledge complementing Beatrice's educational expertise. Together, they helped dozens of children learn to read and write and do mathematics, building confidence in young people who had been told they were incapable. Maggie, true to predictions, did do something remarkable. At 19, she became one of the first women in Nevada to compete professionally in rodeo events, riding broncs and roping cattle with a skill that left audiences speechless. It was not a career that Beatrice had envisioned for her daughter, and there were moments of worry when Maggie came home bruised and battered. But she could not deny that her daughter was happy, living life on her own terms just as Beatrice herself had done. The Thornton Ranch celebrated its 25th anniversary in 1907, and it seemed like half the state came to the party. There was music and dancing, roasted beef and fresh bread, children running everywhere while adults caught up on gossip and news. Beatrice watched from the porch, her leg too painful these days for much standing, but her heart full as she surveyed the scene. Samuel came to sit beside her, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. He was 51 now, his dark hair streaked with silver, lines etched deep around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But he was still the same man who had defended her in the street 25 years ago, still the partner who saw her completely and loved her without reservation. "Happy?" he asked, the same question he had been asking for over 2 decades. "Deliriously," Beatrice answered, the same answer she always gave. They watched their children and grandchildren playing in the yard. Matthew and Catherine had given them 2 grandsons, sturdy boys who loved the ranch as much as their father did. Maggie had recently announced her engagement to a fellow rodeo rider, a quiet man named Jack who treated her like an equal partner. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility. "We did well," Samuel said quietly. "Built something that will last." Beatrice thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off the stage in 1882, braced for rejection and mockery. She thought about how close she had come to giving up, to accepting the world's assessment of her worth. And she thought about the cowboy who had seen her differently, who had changed the trajectory of her entire life with a few simple words of defense. "We did more than well," she said. "We did something remarkable. We proved that love and determination can overcome anything, that the measure of a person has nothing to do with how they walk or what their body can do. We built a family, a ranch, a community, and we did it together." Samuel took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern of her knuckles. "I would do it all again. Every moment, every challenge, every joy. I would choose you 1,000 times over." "And I would choose you," Beatrice said, "every single time." As the sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Beatrice Thornton reflected on the unexpected journey her life had taken. She had come to McGill expecting rejection and had found love instead. She had been mocked for her limp and had proven that she walked taller than all her detractors. She had been told she was less than, and she had built a life that was more than she had ever dreamed possible. The years continued their steady march. Matthew and Catherine took over more of the ranch operations as Samuel slowed down, his body bearing the accumulated injuries of a life of hard work. Beatrice's leg grew worse with age, arthritis settling into joints that had never worked quite right to begin with. But they adapted, as they always had, finding new ways to contribute and support the family they had created. Maggie married her Jack in a simple ceremony at the ranch, then continued traveling the rodeo circuit with her husband. She sent long letters describing her adventures, and Beatrice read them aloud to Samuel in the evenings, both of them marveling at their daughter's courage and independence. In 1910, Beatrice suffered a bad fall that left her unable to walk for nearly 2 months. It was the lowest point since her arrival in McGill, confined to bed and dependent on others for everything. But Samuel never made her feel like a burden. He carried her to the porch so she could feel the sun, read to her for hours, brought her students to her bedside so she could continue tutoring. And slowly, painfully, she recovered enough to walk again with the aid of a cane. "I am not ready to be finished yet," she told Samuel fiercely. "There is too much left to do." "Then we keep going," he said simply. "For as long as we can, we keep going." They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1915, a quieter affair than the ranch's anniversary had been, but no less meaningful. Their children and grandchildren gathered, and Maggie surprised them by announcing she was pregnant. At 32, she had never seemed particularly interested in having children, too focused on her rodeo career. But marriage had changed her, softened some of her harder edges, and she was ready for this next chapter. Beatrice held her daughter's hands and felt the circle completing. She had once been the young woman struggling to prove her worth. Now she was the matriarch, the grandmother, the woman who had lived long enough to see her own strength reflected in her children and grandchildren. It was a gift she had never expected, this long life filled with love and purpose. The war in Europe touched even their remote corner of Nevada. Food was rationed, supplies grew scarce, and young men from McGill enlisted and shipped out to fight in foreign lands. Matthew tried to join but was rejected due to his age and the fact that he was the primary support for his family. He felt guilty about it, but Beatrice reminded him that there were many ways to serve, and keeping the ranch running, keeping people fed, was its own form of patriotism. Maggie's daughter was born in 1916, a tiny thing with her mother's fierce spirit. They named her Beatrice, and the elder Beatrice wept when she learned. To have her name carried forward, to know that she would be remembered not for her limitations but for who she had been and what she had accomplished, was almost more than she could bear. "Your granddaughter will know your story," Maggie promised. "She will know about the woman who refused to let the world tell her what she could not do. The woman who built a life and a family against all odds. That is the legacy you leave, Mother. That is what matters." Samuel's health began to decline in 1918. The injuries from the mine collapse had taken their toll, and decades of hard work had worn his body down. He was 62, still relatively young, but he moved like an old man. Beatrice watched him struggle and felt helpless in ways she had not felt since she was young. She could compensate for her own limitations, but she could not take away his pain. They spent long hours on the porch that summer, watching the sun rise and set over the land they had built together. They talked about everything and nothing, remembering the past and making peace with the present. Samuel held no regrets, he said. He had lived exactly the life he wanted, with the woman he loved, and he was ready for whatever came next. "I am not ready," Beatrice admitted. "I am not ready to lose you." "You will never lose me," Samuel said. "I will be in every corner of this ranch, every lesson you teach, every moment with our family. Love does not end just because breathing does." He passed quietly in his sleep one October night, Beatrice beside him as she had been for 36 years. The grief was overwhelming, a physical weight that pressed on her chest and made breathing difficult. But their children rallied around her, and she found strength in the family they had created together. Samuel was gone, but his legacy lived on in every person whose life he had touched. Beatrice lived another 8 years, long enough to see her namesake granddaughter start school, long enough to watch the ranch continue to prosper under Matthew's management, long enough to see Maggie retire from the rodeo and settle into ranch life with her husband and daughter. She continued tutoring until the very end, her mind sharp even as her body failed. She died in her sleep in the spring of 1926, 66 years old, and surrounded by the family that had been the greatest achievement of her life. They buried her next to Samuel on a hill overlooking the ranch, and the entire town of McGill attended her funeral. The minister spoke of her dedication as a teacher, her strength in the face of adversity, her love for her family. But it was Matthew who gave the eulogy that mattered most. "My mother taught me that strength comes in many forms," he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "She taught me that disability does not mean inability, that difference does not mean less than. She showed me every single day what it means to live with courage and grace and determination. She faced a world that told her she was not enough, and she proved them all wrong. Not by changing herself, but by refusing to accept their limitations. She walked taller than anyone I have ever known, and she will walk through my memory every day for the rest of my life." The story of Beatrice and Samuel Thornton became part of McGill's history, passed down through generations. The ranch remained in the family for over a century, each generation adding their own chapter to the story. But it all started with a woman who limped and a cowboy who saw past the surface to the strength beneath. It started with mockery and defense, with a simple statement that changed everything. "She walks taller than any of you." Those words echoed through time, a reminder that worth is not measured in physical perfection but in character, courage, and the capacity to love and be loved completely. In the end, that was the greatest legacy of all, the proof that a life well lived leaves ripples that never truly end.